There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Shawn the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with a review of an absolutely fantastic novel that I read quite recently. Elizabeth Jane Howard's second novel, The Long View, published in 1956. This was a buddy read with my buddy reader extraordinaire, Leah, in Calgary, and we both absolutely loved it. 5-star read. I had never really heard of Elizabeth Jane Howard. Once I googled her before I read the book, I thought, oh, she's famous because she was one of Kingsley Amis's many wives. Well, now that I've read the book, I want to say, Kingsley who? She is an amazing, underrated novelist, and I am going to be proselytizing and evangelizing about this novel until you all go out and read it. If you like psychological, realist fiction, I don't know that you could read anything better written in the 20th century. Oh my God. So the story opens in 1950 in London, and Mrs. Fleming, unless you read the back cover and remember what her first name is, you don't discover her first name for many dozens of pages. Mrs. Fleming is hosting an engagement party for her 20-something-year-old son. And she's fussing around. Her husband, Mr. Fleming, we don't learn his name for a long time, comes home late to his own son's engagement party. It actually opens with the female guests up in her room, powdering their noses and gossiping somewhat maliciously about Mrs. Fleming. And in that first section, we realize that the 40-something, I think she's 43, Mrs. Fleming, in this first section, 43-year-old mother of the groom, of the soon-to-be groom, is not a very happy person and not in a very happy marriage. In fact, it seems like the marriage may be pretty much ending around the same time that the kid will be married off. And then the story goes from there. And what makes this a unique novel is that it's an inverted structure. So we open in 1950, and then we go back to 4 other sections of these people's lives. The married couple, especially Mrs. Fleming. We jump back to 3 other years earlier in their marriage, including when they met, and then back to when they first were married, and then back to when she was like an 18-year-old girl living in a rather screwed up household in 1926. I'm sure I've read books that told a story backwards before, but none that did it as wondrously as this novel does. I have to quote a line from the introduction. This is one of those novels where whether you read it at the beginning or read it at the end, you must read Hilary Mantel's introduction to this novel. Mantel and Elizabeth Jane Howard were friends. There was a generation between them. Elizabeth Jane Howard, I believe, just died in 2014, and she might have been around 90, late 80s or 90 years old. But they were friends. Hilary Mantel says, "The art lies in its construction, and its construction activates desire." And that is so true, because I felt frustrated in such an incredibly rich way by the fact that we weren't seeing what happened next. We were seeing what happened before, and far enough back, each of the 4 leaps backward, that it's almost as if you're reading about different characters, but they're not different characters. These characters at earlier stages of life are younger people, and their characters are portrayed in medias res, in the middle of whatever situation we find them in for those 5 or 6 or 10 chapters, for that 50 or 75 pages, that even though I entered the earlier section feeling frustrated, well, I want to know what happens next, I got so sucked into what happened then that I lost track of the questions that had animated my reading of the earlier section, which occurred chronologically later. And that desire and its frustration through displacement, because she keeps pulling you in so deep into each successive, regressive part of the story that you lose track of what you were curious about in the later section. And so questions keep coming up for me a couple of weeks later that I had at the beginning of the book. I'm thinking, well, was that ever explained? Leah and I just were whatever the opposite of commiserating. We were celebrating how amazing it was that we'd forgotten all about one key fact that had happened at the beginning of the novel, which was the latest part of the story, by the time we got to the end, and then we had to rethink everything we'd read. And that is the joy of this delightful puzzle of a novel. Just incredible! I am so excited that you probably haven't heard of this novel and that you might go and read it, because I want to talk to you about it. It's a book that deserves to be read and reread and reread. It's also changed my mind about that. I want to see if anybody else has done it as well as she has, that telling a story backwards structure. If you have suggestions about other novels like that. I remember there was one that was translated from the Italian that I bailed on at the end of chapter 1, because chapter 1 was that the married couple were going to divorce. And then when I started chapter 2, I realized, oh, now we're going back to the beginning of their marriage, and I already know they're getting divorced. And I was disgusted, because who cares about why two people might get divorced? And a lot of people love that book. You probably remember the title. I don't right now. It doesn't matter. But that is a book that I may revisit. Although I think that structure was different too, because it went back to the beginning of the marriage and then carried the story forward to the present. This one just keeps going back and back and back. So you, as the reader, are having to make connections or lose track of those connections, and, at the risk of repeating myself, those questions are going to resurface, bubble up to your consciousness a week after you put the book down, or in the middle of the 4th section you're going to remember something you'd completely put out of your mind because you've been so busy soaking up the details of the section you're reading that make you reconstruct your experience of what's happening, and that makes for a wonderful reading experience. So to close, let me just read you one of my favorite sections. It's only using pronouns, I think he and she, so I don't need to explain to you, because it might be a bit of a spoiler to explain who the he and the she are, but independent of any context, I want you to just see the beauty of the writing and the psychological insight. Like a dream, the hours came and were there and went, totally disregarding the time they were supposed to represent. She discovered much later, she discovered much else at the time, that any emotion, if it be sufficiently strong, is elusive, not accurately memorable, that only the small practical fringe, the attendant commonplaces, remain vividly in the mind, and that the memory of them only serves to conceal the core or essence of violently felt experience. So, for a short while, she could remember lying, as it were, on the summit of their mountain, the mists lifted from a vast panorama below, which displayed itself to them as endless, as beautifully comprehensible, a magnificence which they alone were seeing together. And then, very soon, they were left remembering that they had seen it. For longer, she could clearly remember waking, in streaming sunlight, with such a sense of her own comfort and peace, such well-being and delight in herself, that the fleeting revelation of this being the first time she had ever woken thus was almost impersonal, seemed remote and insignificant. She did not stop to question it, although she remembered turning to him, finding him awake and saying, "I feel like exactly as though," and his replying, "I can see, but you feel much, much better than that." Okay, a really enigmatic passage, and so much about that mirrors the journey as a reader that Elizabeth Jane Howard takes you on, and as you try to keep memories of what happened later in the story in your mind as you're exploring what happened earlier in the chronological story that you are reading backwards. I would say the last section where Mrs. Fleming, I'm going to withhold her name because remembering her name, discovering her name is part of the joy of this book, is a young adult not married. Probably was just a little bit too long for my liking, and there were the occasional sentences that were in homage to Henry James, a little bit too abstrusely constructed for their own good. So we're talking maybe 3 times I thought that, 3 sentences out of a 400 and something page novel. I can't think of one other thing that's not exuberantly positive to say about this novel. You have to try it. You have to try it. Thanks for watching.